Well, good afternoon, everyone. We have a lot of great content for you today, and we're looking forward to the interaction. And with that in mind, we want to get kicked off right on time to save plenty of time for the presentation. Uh, so I'm Ryan Stiggy. I'm the program manager for decarbonization, and joining me today is Colton Kennedy, who's the energy portfolio project manager, and our partners at E3. And I want to give a quick thank you to the members of the OPPD Board of Directors that are joining us today for their support on this very important initiative. Today is an exciting day. We will be sharing our final modeling results. This has really been a journey from workshop one up to now. You know, thanks to those of you that have traveled this journey with us, and for those of you that may be joining us today for the first time. Previous workshops were recorded and they are available on oppdcommunityconnect.com. And this workshop will be recorded as well and available at that same website. Now, speaking of this journey, it feels like workshop one was a long time ago, but it was really only 8 months ago. And since that time, the team has walked you through how we arrived at our net zero carbon initiative, how we plan to work through the initiative, what economy-wide multi-sector modeling looks like, our key assumptions and modeling approach, and today, the results of all that work. So the magnitude of work that has gone into this initiative is so impressive. Employees from all across OPPD have been part of this journey, as well as our vendor partners. I'm proud of and in awe of the work that this team has done. Thanks to all of you that have supported getting us to this moment today. And thanks to those of you out there that are joining us and for your commitment to OPPD's and our community's future. Before I turn it over to Colton for the details that you guys are also patiently waiting for, I want to give a quick safety brief. All right, this is timely because it looks like we may get some winter weather tomorrow. So stay safe on winter roads. In extreme weather, stay home if possible. If not, if you need to venture out, make sure you plan for more time, slow down, uh, check the condition of your tires and your wiper blades, and make sure you maintain safe distance behind snow plows. Be aware of their blind spots. And before you take off, make sure you can see, clean your windshield, defrost it, defog it. Um, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah for a minute just to give us a little more context on today's update.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you all for joining us today. I just wanted to give a quick couple housekeeping rules here, and then we're going to jump into a couple of engagement questions to know who's all in the room and what your journey with us has been so far. Then we'll just jump right into the presentation. Real quick, just a reminder to OPPD and E3 staff to please mute your microphones when you're not speaking and silence your electronic devices. As Ryan did mention, this meeting is being recorded and public attendees on WebEx are in listen-only mode. However, there will be opportunities for those public attendees on WebEx here to speak with us and to engage with us throughout. There will be just a couple poll everywhere questions, and I'll give instructions how you can check in on those questions via your phone or your computer. If you've been to events with us before, you're very familiar with that technology. Through WebEx, throughout the entire presentation, we have the little Q&A button available for attendees to ask us questions throughout. If you have clarifying questions that you would like some more information during this presentation, please feel free at any time to use that WebEx Q&A, and we have a whole slew of subject matter experts here on the call ready to help you and answer your questions. Also, throughout this presentation, there will be a couple opportunities to ask your questions verbally. And in order to do that, there is a hand raise tool through WebEx. And when we put up a slide, we'll give instructions on how to raise your hand if you have a question. And if you are calling in on your telephone and you don't have access to a computer and you would like to ask a question, there still is a way for you to verbally ask your questions throughout. So just wanted to give that quick intro as to how we are taking feedback throughout this presentation. With that, I'm going to go over to our first poll everywhere question. We would like to know who is in the room, who's here. We've hosted 5 energy portfolio workshops and an interim modeling update so far this year, as Ryan explained. And we also have created a summary video, and that's for those attendees who wanted to kind of a refresher instead of watching another 8 hours of workshops. What have we done up till now? So we have a summary video that we've put together. I'm going to activate this poll in just a moment, and you could respond by going to pollev.com/OPPD1, or you can text OPPD1 to 22333 once to join, and then you'll have instructions here in just a moment to answer our poll. So bear with me while I just pull that up. I'm going to activate and present it. And here we are. Again, if this is your first workshop, if you attended a couple other events, or if you attended all, and if you've watched a summary video, let us know. You go to pollev.com/OPPD1, or you text OPPD1 to 22333 once, and then you're join. And I'm going to give just a few moments to let people answer this question. This first one is always a little bit more difficult because you're logging in. But I am quite surprised to see that there are so many first-time attendees, and that just thrills me. Thank you so much for coming. We have a good amount of people, about a quarter of the people who have attended a couple of the previous events. And as well, the 25% of you who have attended all of our events, thank you so much for being such an engaged stakeholder throughout this process. And that summary video that I talked about, it's available on oppdcommunityconnect.com. You could find it on the same page as where you registered for that workshop, especially for those of you who this is your first workshop that you've attended. If you probably have a lot of questions. We're going to get pretty technical here into this workshop, and we're going to talk quite a lot about some of the things that we've talked about previously. So you might want to take a moment, if you haven't already, and watch that summary video. It's about 22 minutes, and it really covers everything that we worked up through workshops 1 through 4. So please take a moment to watch that video. And then I will have one more poll everywhere question before we move on. And here you go. We want to know not only if you've been to here before, but who you are, if you wouldn't mind sharing. Do you represent yourself or an organization? If you would like to share, please let us know what is your name and who do you represent. So we have someone from University of Nebraska at Omaha. Welcome, David. We'll just give this a few moments so people can introduce themselves. That's one of the things about WebEx that's a little bit unfortunate, that we can't virtually see everyone that's in the room. So we like to give this opportunity for people to introduce themselves. So those of you who are on this call have an opportunity of who else is viewing this presentation along with you. So just giving this a moment, we're having some really great stakeholders, a lot of names that we do recognize, and welcome you for joining us again. And then we also have, like we saw, quite a few new people. So welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so happy you're here. Just going to give this a moment because it looks like they're all coming through.
Yeah, and while these are coming through, this is actually something that that stakeholders requested that we do early on. So I know we didn't have this in our first meeting, but I think we picked it up by the second or third workshop to allow people to do this.
Exactly. And we have had quite a lot of interest in this last workshop. I think we had more pre-registrations for this last workshop than most of all the other workshops that we've had. So obviously people are excited to see the final results, and a lot of new folks, which is just extremely exciting. So just in interest of time, because I know we have an extremely good presentation ahead of us, and I don't want us to go over, I am going to turn this off, but welcome everyone for coming. Thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. We're so happy to have you here, and I'm just gonna turn it back over to Colton.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm glad to see the level of attendance that we have. I think we have over 90 folks today, at least at this point, and really the amount of sustained participation that we had all the way from the first workshop to this point. And I know that there's a lot of us that may have been with us with the first workshop and are now joining us at the end to see what the results are. So we appreciate their participation as well as we begin to unfold and unpack some of the findings and takeaways that OPPD has from this very large study. So this project, the Energy Portfolio Project, was tasked with studying actionable pathways to eliminate or significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from OPPD's energy portfolio while balancing impacts on reliability, resiliency, and affordability. I can say at this point that the team, through the significant work over the course of the last year, that we've done that, and so we have these findings, and we'll be sharing them as we move through the presentation today. So we're going to start today's workshop with a quick review of where this workshop fits in within the series that we've held. Then we'll review just at a high level the total stakeholder engagement and feedback that we've had. We'll jump into a few key background areas that are going to support and clarify some of the information that we're going to provide today. Then I'll pass it over to our partners at E3 to work through some of the final results and next steps. So a summary of the portfolio optimization, which we shared initial results for in the last workshop. Also, new results from our portfolio risk analysis and resilience analyses that will be shared for the first time with the public. We'll have a comment period, and then we'll pivot to OPPD's key findings from this project and our next steps, and then have more room for comment and discussion after that. So this is actually the last workshop in the series of 6 workshops that we had originally planned. There was a 7th interim modeling update that we held to accommodate stakeholder requests for more details as we went through the details of the modeling throughout the summer. But ultimately, what will happen is we'll take the results, some of the key findings that you're seeing today, and those will be incorporated into OPPD's integrated resource plan. And that integrated resource plan we're going to be publishing in January, and then we're going to have a stakeholder presentation or a presentation of the IRP in February. It's February 3rd, and that would be 4 to 6 p.m. on February 3rd. We're still finalizing some of the details around the time and the date, but that's tentatively what we're planning for. And so we'll be providing more communication on that next engagement, and I'll be talking about it a little bit later in the presentation as well.
But also, before we jump into additional content that Colton has here, I wanted to give you guys, especially since there's so many new folks that are joining us, just a little bit more background about the stakeholder engagement, and just really tell all of you that are on this call how appreciative that we are that you've been with us on this journey along the way. Prior to holding all these workshops, we hosted discovery sessions with some of our key stakeholders to help us shape what the stakeholder journey would look like. This discovery sessions we hosted prior to these workshops were wonderful. We listened, we learned, and we used this feedback to help us prepare for these energy portfolio workshops. Understanding the need for a layer approach, these workshops provided a deeper dive for our most educated and engaged stakeholders. We also produced executive summaries for those not interested in going in the deep dive, but interested in following us along with us into the journey. As you could see on the slide, we not only presented externally to stakeholders, but we also had all of these workshops presented to the OPPD employees as well. Throughout the journey, we've had way more than 100 external stakeholders attending at least one or more of these events, many attending multiple events, as you could tell from that first slide that we shared. And then we have the workshop materials that are hosted online. They have been viewed more than 450 times. So we know that there's quite a lot of interest here in participating in this event. The workshops allowed the stakeholders to be part of this journey with multiple opportunities to participate. As you know, we have the question and answer, we have hand raise, we've had poll everywhere, we have had post-workshop surveys, and then OPPD Community Connect is where everything is housed for you to continue to engage. We've heard a lot of feedback, and including many topics. We've heard about generation preferences, timing of decarbonization, and many more things. So every single thing that we've heard, we've listened to. On OPPD Community Connect alone, we've received more than 70 online comments and questions through that platform throughout this process. So please know that our team reads all the feedback. We take it very seriously, and we hope that you've had satisfaction with this process. I know it has been very satisfactory it's been very fulfilling for us to be able to share this journey with you, and so we hope that you have enjoyed this journey along the way.
Yeah, Sarah, I just want to comment on the amount of feedback that we got from Community Connect since the last workshop. Stakeholders coming in and voicing their opinion on, preference for accelerated decarbonization, and, that OPPD should be looking out for certain new and emerging technologies that may allow us to pivot in a different direction. And then also, comments that stakeholders have brought up around concerns relating to the importance of reliability and resiliency. Which really, I can assure folks, is a foundational requirement of all the analyses that we're doing here. So, yeah, we've heard the comments, we've read the comments, and to a large degree, we've been able to incorporate those comments as we've gone throughout. So getting to a couple of the topics that I'd like to address as far as background before we get into the actual workshop materials today. The first is around the study scope, and that brings us back to what the study is and isn't. So when we set out on this effort, it was, well, I can say it is the most ambitious, broadest, transformational long-term resource planning effort that I believe we've undertaken since probably the formation of the electric grid or rural electrification. But it is a reevaluation, completely of how we're producing electricity to be able to do it in a net zero manner. And so, we evaluated a very broad set of technologies over a very long horizon. And so it was a high level analysis, just out of necessity because of the breadth. It doesn't mean we've had very technical, detailed, quantitative methods to model reliability and resource adequacy as we've gone through. But ultimately, what you'll see from the findings today, what we've been sharing, is something that's directional. It's a number of pathways, and we're looking at the commonalities and consistency across those pathways to be able to achieve the goal. And this is information for decision makers as we embark on this strategic initiative of net zero carbon. And so this is the first set of work, and there is detailed studies, transmission studies, engineering analyses that'll be needed after this effort. And we'll actually talk about some of those next steps once we get to the end of the presentation. And so the second area, just as far as background, we covered this way early on, I think in the first workshop, but there are a range of goals that utilities have for reaching net zero carbon, or for reaching carbon reduction goals. Things that range from very stringent 100% carbon to less stringent, 90, 95% net zero or near zero carbon goals. The two that we've modeled in this work are net zero carbon and zero carbon. And so we have optimization and portfolio solutions that achieve both of those, and we can look at the cost differences and the technology differences required to reach each of those goals. Our goal is net zero carbon by 2050. And so that goal, when we talk about net, that means that you're offsetting, there's credits. And so I want to be really clear as we get into the presentation around what OPPD is including for offsets or credits in its net zero accounting, just so that we have full transparency of the work that we're doing and how we've considered this. So there are four different categories of carbon credits that I'd like to share that we talked about. And I want to share what's included and what's not included. So intersectoral credits are credits that come from being able to claim reductions in other sectors of the economy. So this would be like if OPPD incentivized electric vehicles, we could claim the credit from a reduction in emissions from vehicles and transportation. So we ultimately did not include this type of credit into the modeling, but we're modeling for economy-wide net zero. And so we're including all of the load that would be associated with vehicle electrification and home electrification. So we're planning that as the status quo, but we're not going to just say because we're reducing it in another sector, it allows OPPD to produce more emissions on the other side. So we think to be consistent with sort of the global goal or economy goal of reaching net zero, we're not counting intersectoral credits. The second category is GHG offsets. And these are more traditional programs like tree forestation, afforestation, or agricultural programs to sequester carbon. There's a variety here. What is hard to do with some of these is to prove the additionality of those carbon offsets. How additional are they to doing nothing? And then the permanency of some of those offset programs. So these could be valuable tools for us in the future as we learn more about them, but we're not banking on them as part of our portfolio solutions. The third category here is negative emissions or negative emissions technologies. And this would be something like direct air capture. So an emerging technology that could pull carbon directly from the air and sequester it permanently. This is something that we do include in the modeling at a relatively very high cost and in the later years of the modeling. What we've seen is that the modeling really doesn't pick it. Instead, it picks more affordable ways to reduce emissions than requiring significant levels of negative emissions technologies. And lastly is the category of electricity exports. And so what this is if OPB is able to create a surplus of renewable or clean energy, it is able to export that into the rest of the system and displace other generation that may be more emitting to be able to provide a net carbon benefit to OPPD to help us achieve net zero. And so this is included in the modeling. And I will say that it is something that's very real. When OPPD produces additional clean energy, we have a great wind resource that can very clearly go and reduce the level of emissions from generators elsewhere. What we do have and what we do capture in the modeling, though, is that this becomes more challenging as the whole economy gets to higher levels or percentages of decarbonization. And so that dynamic is captured within the modeling. And we do count electricity exports. Okay, and that's it for the background. So I'm going to turn it over to Zachary Ming with E3.
Okay, thank you, Colton, and glad to be back with everyone to present our final results today. So my name is Zach Ming from E3, and joining me as well is Aaron Burdick and Arnie Olson. Aaron will be presenting a section towards the end, and all of us will be available to answer questions. All right, so let's dive right in. If you go to the next slide, this project phase, set of project phases should look familiar, covers some of the previous analysis that we've done and what we've presented in prior workshops, from our multi-sector modeling to our reliability and resiliency analysis, to the bulk of the project, which was portfolio optimization. We presented those initial results during our prior workshop last month. And today we're going to be presenting a risk analysis on those portfolio optimizations, as well as a summary of key findings. And what is underway as we speak is the development of the final written report. I wouldn't expect that written report to have anything that you haven't seen in this workshop or any of the prior workshops, but it should just be a full documented summary of our entire approach, assumptions, methodology, and results. So if we go to the next slide, we're just going to, essentially everything in this summary section should be familiar with what we've covered in prior workshops, but we just wanted to summarize some of the key takeaways from all of our findings. So if you go to the next slide, we've covered this several times, so hopefully this again is yet again familiar, but one of the key findings from our work is that energy efficiency is a key pillar of decarbonization, both from an economy-wide perspective, which electrification enables economy-wide energy efficiency, but from an electricity sector specific approach. So increasing lighting efficiency, building shell efficiency, and industrial efficiency. You can see some economy-wide efficiency gains presented in this top chart, and then some specific OPPD program, electric efficiency programs presented in this bottom chart. So included in all of our scenarios that you'll see today is aggressive and significant assumptions of energy efficiency. Also included in our portfolios, if you go to the next slide, are assumptions about electrification and assumptions about how the economy will evolve towards net zero. So we are assuming significant growth in electric vehicles, electric heat pumps, and some fuel switching in industry that increases electricity load. And so these charts here on the bottom, won't go into details on those, but those show the rate of electrification for vehicles and buildings and industry. But the key charts here are on the top that shows just how much electrification load is increasing electricity demand for OPPD. And you can see this top chart on the left shows annual growth of energy demand, and the chart on the right shows annual peak energy demand growth. So needless to say, loads are expected to grow significantly over time, somewhere in the range of potentially 2 to 3x what they are today. And that is due to growth in electrification, which is somewhat, again, mitigated by investments in energy efficiency that we covered on the previous slide. So this is really a key challenge for OPPD, the dual challenge of both decarbonizing the electricity sector while meeting these really strong increases in total electricity demand between now and 2050. So if we go to the next slide, we've covered some of the different scenario analysis approaches that we've taken in this project in prior workshops, but we just wanted to briefly rehash those here. There are two key dimensions of scenario analysis that we wanted to explore in this process. One is around the pace of decarbonization. So you can see different paces of decarbonization presented here in this left-hand chart, from a moderated pace to an accelerated pace, and even the inclusion of a net zero by 2035 case that we added based on feedback from stakeholders. We also look at several different technology availability scenarios, from a mature-only scenario where we only include technologies that are commercially available today, so technologies like wind, solar, and batteries, and natural gas. And then we look at also other scenarios that include different sets of emerging technologies like hydrogen or advanced nuclear, carbon capture and sequestration, et cetera. So we pair different combinations of pace of decarbonization and technology availability together for a set of framing scenarios. We also identified a number of important sensitivity factors that we wanted to explore, and those are listed here at the chart on the right. So sensitivity cases around different levels of load growth due to different levels of electrification, it's presented in that top line. Different levels of SPP resource mix, whether SPP procures more or less quantities of wind and solar, that impacts OPPD's ability and economics of trading with neighbors in the rest of SPP, the Southwest Power Pool, which is the market that OPPD is a member of. We run a sensitivity on carbon pricing, looking at if there were some government policy around carbon pricing, how that would impact the optimal portfolio and economics. We look at technology costs, if the costs of existing mature technologies and emerging technologies changes at different paces over time. And then finally, we look at a sensitivity around if higher levels of flexible loads are available. This is a scenario where we assume that customers have an increased ability to consume electricity during specific times of day that are more economic for the system and align better with when the system has abundant energy, like significant quantities of solar production or wind production. And so this can help mitigate or moderate the need for energy storage to move energy around. And this was a sensitivity scenario that we added based on stakeholder feedback. So that, again, that should be familiar, but that's just a refresh of the really broad, robust range of scenarios that we included in this analysis so that we could make sure that, you know, our recommendations and findings for different pathways, we could understand how those compare to one another and what some of the most robust, least risk decisions are for OPPD that hold true across a really wide and broad range of scenarios. So if we go to the next slide, this chart right here, we showed this in our previous workshop, but this chart is really an encapsulation of trying to put all of the results from all of the scenarios onto one chart. So there's a lot going on, but if we walk through it, you can see there are different snapshot years that are presented here from 2027 all the way to the end of the analysis period in 2050. And for each snapshot year, we're showing 5 resources: nuclear, natural gas, solar, storage, and wind. And for each of those resources, we're showing the range of new capacity additions of that resource that the modeling selects. So the way to interpret this is the bar here. The bottom of the bar for each of these is the lowest amount of new capacity additions for that resource that are selected in that year. And the top of the bar is the maximum amount of capacity additions for that resource that are selected in that year. And the dot in the middle is the average across all of the scenarios. So this shows the range of new capacity additions by resource for many different scenarios. And you can see there are relatively large ranges for many of these resources in different years. The biggest factors that cause the range of capacity additions for these bars is around load growth. So higher levels of load growth will require more resources. Lower levels of load growth will require lower resources. And the other big factor is the pace of decarbonization. So more accelerated pace of decarbonization scenarios will build higher levels of renewables and storage earlier in the analysis. And yeah, so I think we're gonna unpack each of these different technologies in a little bit more detail in the risk analysis section to understand the variability between some of the quantities of resource that are built in each scenario. But generally, you can see here that if we just look at the 2050 case, for example, in every scenario, there is quantities of natural gas, energy storage, solar, and wind that are added to the system to help achieve decarbonization and maintain reliability. And there are some scenarios that add nuclear as well. All right, if we go to the next slide. So at the same time as OPPD is adding the resources from the previous slide to help achieve decarbonization, OPPD will also be simultaneously transitioning away from coal, which is a significant source of carbon emissions today. And so transitioning away from coal helps to reduce carbon emissions. You can see that the pace at which OPPD transitions away from coal is highly dependent upon the scenario. But in all cases, if you look at 2050, all coal has been retired by 2050. So what this chart shows is it goes from 0 to 1,000 megawatts, and it shows the pace of coal reduction between now and 2050. And so by 2050, 1,000 megawatts of coal has been reduced in all scenarios, so all of the lines converge at 1,000 megawatts in 2050. And 1,000 megawatts is the sum total of OPPD's portion of Nebraska City 1 and Nebraska City 2. You can see that, again, there's a pretty wide range of the pace of coal transition depending on scenarios. If we look towards the left-hand side of the chart, we can see some of the scenarios that transition away from coal more quickly. So those would be scenarios that have accelerated carbon emission reduction trajectories. the net zero accelerated case, the net zero by 2035 case, as well as the carbon price case that effectively accelerates carbon emission reductions. If you look towards the right-hand side of the chart, you can see some of the scenarios that transition away from coal more slowly. Those would be scenarios that have a slower pace of decarbonization, as well as lower levels of load growth. So there are a couple things to point out here that at the same time as OPPD is transitioning away from coal, just because coal is staying on the system does not mean that it's being continued to be utilized in the same way. So there are ways that OPPD can reduce emissions from coal even before the coal has been fully retired. And that would be through strategies like co-firing with natural gas, so essentially burning coal and natural gas at the same time in the units, which is lower emissions, as well as strategies like seasonal plant operations. So essentially mothballing the coal units during seasons of lower load, like the spring and the fall, and then ramping the resources back up during seasons of higher load, like the summer and the winter. And so even though the coal has not been retired in a scenario like that, that would be a strategy for reducing emissions. There's more studies definitely that would need to be performed to fully understand how those strategies could be utilized.
Yeah, Zach, one of the things we focused on in the last workshop was really the decoupling of the capacity of resources that are used for reliability to support the system at certain times versus the utilization of resources or their capacity factors and how much energy those resources actually produce. And so, when we modeled, we had a relatively small set of options that we could feasibly put within the very complex optimization process. We considered retirement, repowering, and continued operation. I think you just mentioned, Zach, there's a spectrum of options like seasonal generation or co-firing that allow us to continue to reduce emissions, as we move through and pivot and also maintain some of the, reliability attributes of those resources, and we ensure that we have those on a transitioning system. So I think that's a really important point. We kind of got into last time, but we wanted to re-emphasize that at this point.
Yep, absolutely. And I guess the final point to raise here is that the modeling does repower these coal units to run on natural gas in all of the scenarios. So you can see this listed in the bullet here at the top. And the reason for that is because the system, even though it's adding a lot of these other resources that we looked at on the previous slide, lots of wind, lots of solar, lots of storage, it does still retain a significant need for firm generation, and particularly in light of the growing loads from electrification and continuing to leverage the infrastructure of these facilities is a low-cost economic way to procure firm capacity.
And even before we continue, I just wanted to point out, just as a comparison, like OPPD's converted facilities at the North Omaha station, units 1 through 3, when they were on coal, they ran 85, 90% of the time. Once they've converted to gas, they're run, less than 5% and closer to 1 to 2% per year just during critical periods. So, you're achieving that backup capacity for a resource that you've already invested in, and it's really not producing very often or emitting that much because it's not producing. So we'll talk a little bit around the specific, firm resource needs, I think, as we get into the resilience section. But again, kind of highlighting a parallel here.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. So this chart here summarizes the cost impacts of decarbonization across a range of scenarios. You can see what this chart is showing is relative to today's average rate for OPPD, which is 8.8 cents, what the incremental cost of decarbonization is in 2050. And so in 2050, if we look at across these range of scenarios, we can see that the incremental cost of decarbonization is somewhere between 0.7 cents all the way to 9.1 cents on the far right. If we just focus on these middle set of blue bars for a second, these are our net zero cases, we can see that the cost impacts of achieving net zero carbon range somewhere between 1.1 and 1.9 cents per kilowatt hour. So cost is absolutely always in the eye of the beholder, but we do think that these cost impacts are relatively moderate. These cost impacts are somewhere between 10 and 20% increases relative to today's average system rate, and that's a in 2050 number. Cost will be 10 to 20% higher. So if we think about an annual increase, that would be something like 0.3 to 0.6% annual increases on a real basis between now and 2050, ultimately achieving the 10 to 20% higher rate levels by 2050.
Yeah, and that's relative, yeah. I'm sorry, that's relative to the reference case. So things like inflation or, inflation or labor costs or different factors that might otherwise affect the rate aren't included. This is just looking at the incremental cost of OPPD decarbonizing its energy portfolio relative to a reference case that does not.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for the clarification. So that incremental cost relative to the reference case, in our base case, which our base case is the net zero balanced load case, you can see right there in the middle of the blue cluster of bars, is 1.4 cents per kilowatt hour incremental cost. If we look at the two cases to the right of that, those are two cases that also achieve net zero by 2050, but at an accelerated pace. So the accelerated case simply gets emission reductions more quickly, and actually the by 2035 case is the net zero by 2035. What you can see from these cases is that they are more expensive than the net zero balanced case or the base case, but they are really not that much more expensive. Something like 1/10 of a cent to 2/10 of a cent per kilowatt hour more expensive in 2050 than the base case. So I think what this broadly shows us is that while decarbonization does have a slight cost impact and accelerating decarbonization has an even slightly higher cost impact, the cost impacts can be relatively moderate, and it could be well worth it to accelerate carbon emissions, even for that incremental cost, because there's value that comes from accelerating carbon emissions. Accelerating carbon emissions means that total emissions over the entire time horizon between now and 2050 is lower than a case that doesn't accelerate carbon emissions reductions. So these middle cases here in blue are net zero cases. We also ran a number of absolute zero emission cases. So as Colton said, these are cases that completely eliminate all carbon emissions on the system. They don't allow for any offsetting through selling renewable energy to neighbors or direct air capture. And what this shows is that while it is technically feasible to absolutely reduce all emissions from OPPD's system, it is significantly less economic, particularly if there are no emerging technologies. So this far right case in dark red shows an absolute zero case where only commercially available mature technologies are available. So that would be resources like wind, solar, and battery storage. And what this shows is that the cost of eliminating carbon emissions with only those resources is significantly costly. And that's primarily due to the challenges that those resources have in maintaining reliability and the need to build significant quantities of those resources to maintain reliability during challenging periods. Okay. All right, so that is an overview of the summary, and now we're going to dive into some new risk analysis results. So if we go to the next slide, to frame the way that we are thinking about risk in this decarbonization portfolio exercise, it is significantly different than the way that financial risk is generally analyzed in electricity sector planning processes. In traditional electricity resource plans, the biggest sources of risk are around fuel prices that are variable and uncertain, and around uncertain environmental regulations that, for example, a carbon tax that could apply an additional cost to carbon emissions on the system. In a decarbonized system that is trending towards net zero, these costs are reduced and ultimately eliminated. A decarbonized system that relies very little on fuel costs, because almost all of the costs are fixed costs of building new wind and solar and battery resources, has very little risk exposure to fuel prices. And because it has very little emissions, it also has very little exposure to environmental regulation risk. In fact, the real risks of a deeply decarbonized electricity system are the risks that a new technology will come along that will be better or cheaper or something relative to investments that have already been made on the system, and that will create a potential stranded cost situation where OPPD will not be able to take advantage of the new resources, the new cheaper resources, because they've already made investments, or they will make those new investments and then not be able to utilize the existing investments that they've already made because they're utilizing the new resources. And so in thinking about risk from this perspective, what we really wanted to analyze was what risks might, or what investments might OPPD come to regret potentially, depending on evolution of new technologies or other uncertainties on the system. So what we're looking for in this risk analysis section is, what are the least regrets investments that OPPD could make to help mitigate risk? And again, that's looking across a wide range of scenarios and thinking about what is the optimal investment of each technology across a wide range of scenarios, and trying to look at what sets of technologies are selected robustly regardless of the assumptions that are chosen. And those investments are low risk. Okay, so that is an overview of the section. So what we're going to do is just dive into each resource and analyze risk from that perspective. So starting with solar, we're going to be looking at a number of charts that are in the same format. We have a different slide for each resource, so I'll just take a minute to orient what this chart is showing here for solar. What you can see is that we have many different scenarios listed along the bottom. So for example, breakthrough cost, carbon price, etc. And what these bars show is the total quantity of solar that's selected in each scenario in the years 2030 and 2050. The dark yellow bars are the 2030 values, and the lighter yellow bars are the 2050 values. And in this left-hand chart, we have a number of scenarios that we believe represent the key risk uncertainties that could unfold. And if we look across all of these uncertainties and sensitivities that we analyzed, what we see is that there is significant and robust quantities of solar that are built in all of these scenarios. In the lowest case, we see 1,146 megawatts in the carbon price case. This is in 2030. And then we see upwards of 2,000 megawatts of new solar built in almost all of the other scenarios in 2030. And these values are even higher in 2050. So what this shows us is that even across a wide range of uncertainties, solar is a low-risk investment because it is part of a least cost optimal portfolio no matter how these uncertain scenarios unfold. We have also, if you look at this chart on the right, separated out an additional set of uncertainties around load. So what you can see here is that we have several different load uncertainty cases, from lower load levels, which is the cluster on the left, all the way to higher load levels on the right. And the reason we've separated out load uncertainties from the other key risk uncertainties is because while load is definitely a big source of uncertainty, it is something that will evolve over time that OPPD can adapt to. And so it doesn't present the same type of risk as something like technology evolution. OPPD can continue to monitor load growth. If it's growing, load is growing faster than expected, OPPD can accelerate new resource development, or if it's load is growing slower than expected, then OPPD can moderate new resource development. So definitely higher load levels mean more resources, more of everything. Lower load levels mean the opposite, but it is something that OPPD can adapt to, and so we don't see it as on quite the same level of risk as some of the other key risk uncertainties that are presented in the left-hand chart. But again, the moral of the story here is that if you look at all of these 2030 cases, there's significant quantities of solar, new solar, and the solar that you see here is actually additional and incremental to new planned solar that's already being developed right now through the Power with Purpose program. And you can see, if we look at the lighter yellow bars here, the 2050 bars for solar, again, across a wide range of scenarios, there's significant quantities of solar that's a part of an optimal portfolio of resources. So solar really is a robust, least cost resource for OPPD to pursue to achieve net zero. All right, so if we go to the next slide.
Zach, just for clarity, the dark shade bars are the 2030 levels, and the light shade levels are 2050. We had some questions in the chat on that. So if we flip back to that previous slide for a second, yeah, the darker shade of yellow here is all levels by 2030. Thanks.
I think that's a key point, Colton, really quick. It is by 2030 and by 2050, not in 2030 or in 2050. So these are cumulative amounts of megawatts, just to be super clear.
Thank you, Javier.
That's correct. Yes, thank you. Excellent. All right. So hopefully we're oriented with this admittedly somewhat funky chart design, but if we go to the next slide, we'll see this exact same construct for wind. So again, a range of scenarios listed here along the bottom, and we show the total quantity of wind that's selected by 2030 in the dark blue bars here along the bottom, and the total quantity of wind that's selected by 2050 in the lighter blue bars. The key takeaway for wind is actually very similar to solar, and that is, if we look across all of these scenarios, the total quantity of wind that's selected by 2030 is actually fairly constant. You know, it doesn't really dip below 500 megawatts in any of these scenarios. And if we look forward to 2050 and the key risk uncertainties, it's clustered around 5,000 megawatts. There are some scenarios, you can see here there's an outlier in the carbon price scenario, where by 2030 there's 1,900 megawatts of wind that's selected. That is in part to compensate for the lower levels of solar in that case. You'll notice on the previous slide, the carbon price case had lower levels of solar. This higher level of wind is making up for it. So the carbon price is an accelerated carbon reduction scenario. But the key takeaway here is that across by the 2030 bars and the 2050 bars, they're all relatively equal to each other. And so wind, again, is a robust resource that's selected to help achieve net zero across a range of different assumptions and scenarios. And so we see this as a relatively low risk investment for OPPD. All right, next slide. We have here another important resource to help achieve net zero: energy storage. The key takeaway here is more of the same as we've seen for solar and wind. We can see that the dark purple bars show the total quantity of energy storage that is an optimal part of the portfolio by 2030, and the lighter purple bars by 2050. And what we can see again, while there is a little bit of variation in these scenarios, in all scenarios, there are robust and significant quantities of new energy storage that is an optimal part of OPPD's pathway to zero carbon. All right, next slide. So this next slide is covering new firm generation capacity. And I know this is probably a topic that many stakeholders are interested in, but this really shows the quantity of new firm generation, in other words, new natural gas generation that we are forecasting is a part of a least cost portfolio to achieve net zero by 2050. And the first question that some stakeholders might have is, how is natural gas generation consistent with a net zero electricity system? And the short answer to that is that, as Colton said earlier, the natural gas generation that remains on the system in 2050 that's needed for reliability will be used very sparingly. And so it will be emitting very small quantities of greenhouse gases. But any emissions that do come from that natural gas would need to be offset. And again, this OPPD has a net zero goal, so there is opportunities for offsetting those emissions, and that could be achieved by either exporting renewable energy, selling renewable energy to neighboring utility systems, or by directly capturing carbon dioxide out of the air and storing it underground. An alternative to that actually is burning fuels in the natural gas generation that don't emit carbon dioxide in the first place. So for example, burning hydrogen in the natural gas plants or burning biofuels would actually not require any offsetting, because if the hydrogen is produced from renewable energy, it's green hydrogen, and then it doesn't create any carbon emissions through combustion in the natural gas plant. And biofuel is by design a net zero carbon source of fuel. So neither of those fuel sources would require any offsetting in the first place. And so before we dive into the numbers here, I think what's really important to just point out, we can see a number of different scenarios here. And we can see that across almost all of these scenarios, there are new quantities of natural gas generation that are required by 2030 and relatively significant quantities of new natural gas generation that are required by 2050. In fact, every scenario has new quantities of natural gas generation, except for one, which is on the far left here, and that is the absolute zero mature only scenario. And the reason that doesn't have natural gas generation is because it explicitly wasn't allowed in that scenario. It's not allowed because it's an absolute zero case, so there's no netting allowed in that case. And the mature only part of that means that hydrogen is not an option on the table. So it's so essentially natural gas is not even a viable option in this scenario by design. But every other scenario shows that that new natural gas is a critical piece to play in achieving net zero. And as we'll cover in the resiliency section here coming up, the reason that this natural gas generation is required is for reliability purposes. But I think the broad takeaway here is that new natural gas generation can and does have a robust role in a net zero electricity system with minimal risk of becoming a stranded asset. You can see that shown by the fact that natural gas is selected across a really wide range of scenarios. And it has a minimal risk of being stranded, particularly if the natural gas generation is hydrogen ready or biofuel ready.
Zach, we have a question from the audience around, if it is hydrogen, what are the costs that we assumed? So I guess stepping back, in this whole analysis, these firm resources we're modeling as hydrogen capable resources that would be emitting, but still meet the net zero targets of the various pace of decarbonization scenarios that we have. And eventually, their fuel may be able to be displaced by hydrogen or these other fuel types. In 2050, the results that we see, when they generate, they're going to have to generate on hydrogen to be able to meet net zero goals effectively, or the vast majority of the time. And the hydrogen costs that we assume include the cost of producing green hydrogen, which I think there's like a variety of potential ways that may be produced, but E3's cost assumptions are based on resources that are non-grid interconnected, high capacity factor renewable resources. So I guess anything you'd like to supplement, Zach, or did I get it right?
Yep, that's exactly right.
Great.
All right, I think we can go to the next slide. So the last resource here to cover from a risk analysis perspective is nuclear. And nuclear was a resource that we made available to the modeling in all of our scenarios. The model selected nuclear if the model determined that it was an economic component of an electricity system that achieves net zero reliably. What we can see here is if we look across, again, same format, across a range of scenarios, nuclear was not selected by the modeling in almost all of the scenarios. So there's 0 megawatts of nuclear selected by 2050 across most of the scenarios. There are 2 exceptions to this. You can see those sticking out very clearly here. The first is the breakthrough cost scenario. So if there's a scenario where the cost of nuclear drops significantly and drops significantly relative to all of the other zero carbon resources, like wind, solar, battery storage, et cetera, then nuclear would become an economic resource. And so I do know we had stakeholder comments and questions about the cost assumptions of nuclear, and while those are admittedly uncertain, if nuclear were to materialize and become a commercially available resource with very low costs, then we would expect OPPD to consider that as a resource. And so that's demonstrated here in this breakthrough cost scenario. The other primary scenario where nuclear was selected is on the right here. You can see this absolute 0 plus no H2 or no hydrogen scenario. This essentially is a scenario that does not allow any carbon emissions. It's an absolute 0 case, so there's no netting, and it doesn't allow any hydrogen generation. So the system is looking for firm resources that don't emit carbon dioxide, and nuclear is one of those resources. So if OPPD were to pursue an absolute 0 policy and hydrogen does not emerge as a viable or economic candidate resource, then nuclear might be an economic part of OPPD's portfolio. But what's important to point out here is that in both of these cases, both of these scenarios, the quantity of nuclear that's selected by 2030 is 0 megawatts, and it's not until 2050, or sometime between 2050 and 2030, that nuclear is selected as an economic resource. And so there is significant amount of time for OPPD to monitor how the nuclear technologies, particularly the advanced nuclear technologies like small modular reactors, how those technologies evolve and how those costs evolve over time. All right, if we go to the next slide, this just summarizes everything that we've walked through, thinking about risk from all of the various resources. A few key takeaways. Number one, significant quantities of wind, solar, and battery storage are robust findings across a wide range of scenarios, and so therefore are a low risk action for OPPD to help achieve down the pathway of net zero. You can see that the minimum quantity of new resource build by 2030 is 1,100 megawatts of solar, 500 megawatts of wind, and 150 megawatts of battery storage. And almost certainly the optimal quantity of these resources is even higher than this. This is just the minimum quantity of resource that's selected across the different scenarios. These quantities here are, again, incremental to planned power with purpose addition. So this does not include the 600 megawatts of new solar that's being built as part of the Power with Purpose program. This 1,100 megawatts is incremental to that. Other key takeaways is OPPD should continue to monitor long-term uncertainties like load, and fortunately, load is something that will evolve over many years, so OPPD has time to continue to monitor that and adjust procurement plans as load and electrification evolves. Another key takeaway is that new firm capacity additions, specifically new natural gas that is ready to burn hydrogen, green hydrogen, or biogas, new additions of this resource are consistent with an optimal net zero portfolio and are low risk. These are resources that are selected across a wide range of uncertainties as an economic option to help OPPD maintain reliability, particularly as OPPD transitions away from coal. And finally, nuclear is only a cost-effective part of OPPD's portfolio in a few scenarios. The scenarios where costs drop dramatically or OPPD cannot develop hydrogen-ready natural gas generation. And so nuclear is a technology that OPPD should continue to monitor and reassess as that technology develops. Okay, next slide.
I guess before we pivot into the next section, I do want to highlight, I think, folks saw the series of graphs on the different resources is the homogeneity or the consistency of the resources that are selected. That's something that we didn't necessarily expect coming into the study, but seeing just the consistency of resources across all of them, I think is pretty a pretty important finding, and I guess we'll hit on that later in the presentation as well.
Yeah, and maybe if I could just add one more thought on that, Colton. I think one of the reasons why we see that is because there isn't a question of is OPPD going to pursue net zero. OPPD has made that commitment. And the question is just how does OPPD achieve net zero? If it was on the table of, what is the carbon reduction policy, then we might see a much broader range of wind and solar and battery storage builds. But because OPPD has made a commitment to gradually ramp down to net zero, I think that's one of the key sources for why we see such robust findings across these technologies. All right, now we will pass it over to Aaron Burdick from E3, who's going to walk through the resiliency section.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good to be with you here today. I'll be presenting the resiliency analysis. So next slide, please. After looking at a range of scenarios that Zach just presented on in the risk analysis, we're now going to drill down into a single scenario. So we're going to look at the net zero carbon balance load forecast portfolio, which is shown on the left of this slide. And we're going to look at that portfolio in 2050 when OPPD is achieving net zero. And for these case studies, we're going to look at 4 different types of resiliency challenges. And when we developed this portfolio, we used E3's recap model, which is a loss of load probability analysis tool, to ensure that the portfolio meets the 1-day and 10-year reliability standard adopted by SPP. And so it's meeting that resource adequacy target. But then for these resiliency case studies, we're looking at a broader range of extreme weather impacts than are traditionally considered in resource adequacy modeling. So the first case study that we look at is extended low wind and solar output. So this is the one that actually is included in our resource adequacy analysis based on historical conditions of low wind and solar. And then the 3 other case studies go beyond the resource adequacy modeling assumptions and methods to add additional resiliency stresses. So we're going to look at an extreme summer heat event, extreme winter cold polar vortex-like conditions, and then we'll talk a bit about how specific localized events that might be catastrophic to generators or transmission lines on OPPD system, how OPPD may be able to withstand and recover from these types of events. Next slide, please. So starting off with the shift of reliability periods to periods when low wind and solar are a challenge. On this slide, we have 3 heat maps, as we like to call them. So these are tables essentially with hour of day in the columns and month of year in the rows. And we're showing 2021, 2030, and 2050 from modeling results from our recap tool. And in red, what you see are the times of the year that feature the greatest reliability challenge. So what we see today in 2021 is that the hours of reliability challenge align with the peak demand period for OPPD's load, which is in the summer early afternoon from around 3 to 5 p.m. Moving to the middle figure, by 2030, we see that growth in solar through power with purpose, as well as the additional solar that we're modeling is added on the pathway to net zero. That solar energy pushes the hours of reliability challenge from the traditional growth load peak into the early evening, what we term the net load peak. And this is a phenomena that we've already started to see in California. And so we do expect to see that in OPPD as well by 2030. Moving to the bottom chart, now we're looking at a 2050 net zero system, which is almost entirely wind and solar generation. And what we see is a further shift in the hours of reliability challenge. Within the summer, we see that challenge shifting into the nighttime period, essentially. And that's driven by simulated events of low wind output combined with high summer loads. So we'll drill into that specific sort of extreme summer event shortly. But interestingly, we see that the primary reliability challenge moves into the winter period. So now you see more red boxes in the months of November, December, and January. And that phenomena is driven by the fact that we're increasing our winter electricity demand from space heating electrification by 2050. And the net load, instead of just getting shifted a couple hours, as we see by 2030, gets shifted to those times of the year when we may have low wind and solar for extended multi-day periods. This is the so-called Dunkelflaute, a German word meaning dark doldrums challenge that we talked about in the previous workshop. So both of these events can be, the OPPD system can withstand these types of low wind and solar events either in the summer and the winter by maintaining and adding any necessary new firm capacity per the slide that Zach talked about a few minutes ago. And firm capacity is capacity that can operate on demand for multiple hours or sometimes multiple days. And we're assuming in our resource adequacy modeling that that firm capacity also has fuel security, something which we'll explore in a moment here when we talk about winter resiliency. So let's dig deeper into this summer heat challenge. Next slide, please. So for the extreme summer heat resiliency case study, we focused on a historical weather condition whereby there was a 4-day heat wave event, and those days all exceeded 110 degrees in maximum temperature. So very hot week. And we're going to look at how the 2050 net zero portfolio responds during 3 different types of conditions. So the first in the top graph is a high renewables week. The bottom is a low renewables week, and then shortly we'll jump to a low renewables week with additional resiliency stresses. So I wanted to remind folks that the data that we're showing here in these charts, which are similar to those that we showed in workshop 5, shows the energy available from wind, solar, and storage, and then it shows in gray the firm generation that's required to back up those resources when that energy is unavailable. And the output of wind and solar in these cases is based on historical weather correlations, which we use as inputs into our recap tool. So what we saw is that there have been past hot weeks whereby we have both significant solar and wind output. So that's the type of system condition that we see at the top. There's very little gray on that chart, meaning that for that week, there's very little firm capacity output that's necessary to keep the lights on for OPPD. But we also saw in the historical record that there were periods during the summer where particularly the wind generation was much lower. And that's what we see on the bottom chart with additional gray area representing the need for backup firm capacity resources to fill in the gap. So we do see the portfolio that we developed in Resolve is able to ride through this low renewable week based on the firm capacity that's retained and or added to the system. Let's now jump to additional stresses on that system as part of the resiliency study. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at the same graph on the bottom with a few tweaks. So first off, we modeled a 10% increase in load that's consistent with a climate change scenario of a 5-degree temperature increase in Omaha. And under this extreme heat condition, we also modeled an 11% derate due to thermal efficiency loss for the firm capacity and additional heat-related outages for energy storage. So what we see is that this condition did not trigger any reliability shortfalls. So the resources are sufficient to cover the black line there, which is the OPPD load for the week. But we do see that the firm capacity has to work a bit harder to fill in the gap associated with additional load. And you can see that with the arrows called out, we do see the firm capacity is actually getting used to charge energy storage so that the system can satisfy load during the low wind events in the evening. So now we'll look at an extreme winter cold event.
Aaron, I'm
slide,
sorry,
please.
before we move on, I do want to make some comments. So, you know, one of the stakeholder sort of questions and comments that we received repeatedly throughout the process is, in some of these climate change scenarios, you know, we're going to expect unprecedented, you know, very extreme conditions, either, you know, very high temperature days or very high, you know, very deep cold periods. And so, you know, one of the things that we're doing in this resilience analysis is we're looking at a future where we're stress testing, with higher than expected loads, assuming that there's some impact here for this particular event of unprecedented, I guess, climate change on the weather, and then thus the load. So that's one of the comments that we received repeatedly. We heard it, we integrated it into the analysis. I think the other thing I'd like to comment on, and Zach and Aaron, is the amount of demand side management that we're expecting and including in scenarios like these. And so when we did all of our loss of load modeling and resource adequacy modeling, the resources could dispatch to be able to meet the 1-day and 10-year standard. Can you explain a little bit of how demand side fits into some of these extreme weather scenarios? I guess maybe the opportunities, but also maybe the limitations of demand side resources as you get protracted periods.
Sure. Maybe I'll take that one, and Aaron can chime on with anything. I think, one of the big challenges, and illustrated in this chart, but in several other situations as well, is that you can see here the firm generation is dispatching for multiple days straight. Days 1, 2, and 3, and every hour have firm generation or natural gas generation that's dispatching. In most of the other weeks of the year, the natural gas generation isn't needed at all. So this is a critical week, an outlier week for sure. But in this 3-day stretch, there's firm generation that's needed. And so what that shows is that there really isn't any benefit to moving load from 1 hour of the day to another hour of the day within this period. This period has a deficit of total energy, and the only way to reduce the need for firm generation would be to move energy from this 3-day period to outside this 3-day period. And so to the extent that there are loads that can shut off for 3 days straight and make up that energy during different days, then that might be a potential demand side opportunity that could reduce the need for firm generation. But flexible loads that can just move energy within the day would not be viable solutions to help mitigate the need for firm generation in this particular example. And so just to give an example of what some of these flexible loads are that can move energy within the day, this would be something like smart thermostats that cool your home during particular hours and then use less energy during other hours, or smart electric vehicle charging that charges in the middle of the day when there's lots of solar, or at night when demand is low, but not in the evening. Most people aren't going to be able to completely avoid charging their cars for 3 days straight if they still need to get around during those 3 days, if we want the economy to still continue to run during these 3 days. So in general, those type of more common flexible loads like smart thermostats or smart electric vehicle charging would not be viable demand side options to reduce the need for firm generation capacity in this type of a situation.
On the other hand, Zach, opportunities like energy efficiency, that have the ability to reduce total load over an extended period of time and are totally passive, they provide this resiliency benefit just because you don't have such a resource intensive system. So it's sort of a difference between traditional demand side type resources over extended events like this versus future opportunities with energy efficiency in these more energy restricted periods. So that's probably, that's an important finding. That's something that we've discussed a lot internally, but I'm glad we got to talk a little bit about it in the public session. And the other thing is we see a lot of dispatch of the the firm resources in this period. These are not typical weeks, and we typically wouldn't have this much firm generation dispatch. These are extreme events, so I think there's some questions around looking at the total amount of gray. Just highlighting again, this is not usual, and this gets back to the capacity versus energy discussion we had in the last workshop.
Yeah, and just another point to make on the flexible load side. So flexible loads basically shift load within a day, and short duration battery storage resources shift generation within the day. So they're effectively providing a very similar type of service. And you can see that if you're able to shift some of the renewable output here to other hours, you might be able to avoid the total instantaneous firm capacity requirement that might be able to be reduced a bit, even if you're not able to reduce the need for energy across those 3 days. So that's exactly what happens when our model is adding energy storage to the portfolio. That has actually reduced the total amount of firm capacity that's needed by the system. And we did run a sensitivity considering higher amounts of flexible loads available. And we did see that that indeed displaced some of the short duration storage from the portfolio. So let's move on to the winter extreme event. So we'll follow the same format as the summer event. And again, we're looking at the 2050 system. And as Colton alluded to, many weeks of the year, and I should say many winter weeks look similar to the top chart. So the wind in Nebraska tends to blow quite strongly in the winter. The solar output, for obvious reasons, is less than in the summer, but you tend to see significant wind output in the winter. But again, looking at historical periods, we do see there are cold days that have low wind output, and also with winter storms rolling through, low solar output. So that's the scenario we see on the bottom chart. And the week that we chose for the extreme winter cold case study is similar to a sort of polar vortex type condition. So there are 4 days that have the daily minimum temperatures below -20 degrees Fahrenheit. So quite frigid. And you can see even more dramatically here that that period has very low renewable output and a significant need for firm capacity to fill in the gap. So again, this is sort of a rare week in the winter, but one that must be planned for to ensure that there's not dangerous customer outages during these extreme cold conditions. So we found that in the case here on the bottom, our portfolio was able to serve load based again on the firm capacity that Resolve had selected for the portfolio. So let's move on now to the same week, but under additional resiliency stresses. So again, we have the chart on the bottom and the table here outlining the changes that we made. So most importantly for this event, we have reduced the amount of firm generation that's available to represent a disruption in the fuel supply. And that reduction is about 40 to 50% during this extreme cold period. And that is offset somewhat by some of the current OPPD units that have on-site fuel tank storage that can operate for 2 to 3 days. But the rest of the firm generation we model as facing a fuel supply disruption. And this is actually a similar type of scenario as occurred earlier this year during Winter Storm Uri in SPP, and even more dramatically within Texas. So the way that we set up this event was to actually parameterize it based on the conditions that occurred earlier this year in SPP. And secondarily, because this is a low wind week when we have this reliability challenge. Reducing the wind output is not that big of a stress, but we do model a reduction in wind output due to turbine icing. That's also consistent with what happened earlier this year, and a small reduction in storage output. So under these extreme simulated conditions, here we do see reliability events. These occur during the nighttime periods after the sun has gone down under low wind output, when the firm capacity doesn't have sufficient fuel security to operate during these periods. And this is sort of similar to what we saw in Texas, and it's a challenge that faces various markets in the US today and will continue to cause challenges unless these resiliency events are studied and mitigated. So how can these events be mitigated to ensure that this scenario that we're showing here doesn't actually occur and customers aren't without power during negative 26-degree temperatures in the middle of the night? So there's three options that we note in the bottom right of this slide. The most important is winterizing the fuel delivery infrastructure. So ensuring that the wellheads and fuel storage and fuel pipeline delivery systems can withstand extreme cold temperatures and still operate will ensure that there's sufficient fuel to deliver to firm capacity in these types of events. Adding additional on-site backup fuel is another option. So if the pipeline goes out, you have an on-site source of fuel to fill in the gap for a few days until things come back online. And then, again, sort of less important, by 2050, because most weeks have high wind output, but also an important investment to make is wind turbine de-icing technology, which is common in new wind farms in extremely cold parts of the Midwest and Canada. So this can enable wind turbines to operate during extreme cold conditions and is sort of a no-regrets investment for OPPD that we believe they should pursue.
Aaron, I want to make a couple of comments at this point. You know, I think we've focused a lot on resiliency and we've focused a lot on really challenging periods for the system. And, you know, to the audience, you know, we didn't do this to say that we can't achieve a decarbonized portfolio or that renewables challenge the system. I think it's just the opposite. You know, we've tested these resiliency cases to learn how the system can operate reliably and can operate, you know, resiliently, you know, during conditions like this. You know, I think what we see though from the last few slides is there is a, you know, unique role for firm dispatchable resources during certain critical periods. And this is the time that challenges the electric grid most. And it's even challenging the electric grid today, you know, much less in 2050 with a different resource mix. And so, you know, the types of investments on these firm resources during these critical periods that we make today are still important, you know, throughout this horizon, even as we go till 2050. So I think that was a really important learning as we looked at these. You know, the challenges today will persist, and we need to make sure that we're, you know, cognizant and focused on them. And I think, you know, to supplement some more, you know, you do see that in these scenarios, having more renewables does offset, you know, some degree the need for those thermal resources. We talked about energy efficiency as sort of the first fuel or the first resource that helps support these situations, you know, with lower load. So there's just a lot that goes into these. We're about to focus on a scenario here if we didn't have these firm resources. But you know, the reality is that there's some really important things here. You know, energy efficiency is really important on this topic. investments in renewables are very important to achieve the goal of net zero, but there's also a role of firm generation, firm capacity. So I guess back over to you, Aaron, for the next.
Yeah, and this is Arnie Olson from E3. Maybe there's one final comment on that, Colton, which is that these are challenges that aren't unique to OPPD. Really there are utilities and power system operators all over the world looking at these kind of graphs and trying to figure out how to solve these same kind of problems. So these are fairly universal. I think we're studying them more and more and understanding them more and more. But they really are very significant challenges. And, I think we hope and expect that over the next, 20 years, more and more solutions will be developed. But this is the best that we can do looking forward from where we sit today.
And Cole, before you move on, I think there was a comment about the 5 or 6% in that particular slide. I thought maybe you'd want to address that.
Which 5 or 6%?
Is the area in slide 37 a significant amount of unserved load? And I think we had a comment from the team about that being in comparison to the 5 or 6% of load shed we had during the polar vortex and what that white area represents there.
Yeah, I don't have that readily available for the unserved energy during this period, but we can follow up with that.
Okay.
Yeah, we can follow up.
Thanks.
So let's move on to the next slide. As Colton mentioned, we did run one case whereby we have less firm capacity to see how the system would perform under those conditions. So there have been some stakeholders who have asked whether OPPD can meet its net zero carbon goal by 2050 without having to add any new firm capacity while also retiring its existing coal generation. And so that's the scenario that we're looking at here based on one of the portfolios suggested by stakeholders in 2035. We took that and modeled it in our recap resource adequacy tool, and these are the results. So we did find that portfolio was not reliable relative to the 1 day in 10-year standard that FPP has adopted. So on the table on the bottom right, we provide some of the statistics from our recap tool. So 1 day in 10 years translates to 0.1 days per year. So that's the standard that we use to develop the portfolios in our resolve model. We can see here that this portfolio without those firm capacity additions has 65 days per year on average with customer outage events. So that is significantly less reliable and a bit concerning. And in the center, we see how the system might perform in a critical week in the absence of those additional firm capacity resources. So there's actually 3 days in this week that feature reliability events. And on day 7, we can see the difference between the resources available, and that black line is quite significant, indicating up to roughly half of customers on outage for nearly half the day. And this is before we perform any additional resiliency stresses. And then it's also in the absence of electrification load growth, which we show in red to indicate additional loads that could be driven by fuel switching from natural gas and gasoline to electricity. So, this is sort of one of the key themes as we've heard about today and talked about throughout this project is what are the enabling technologies to make alongside massive investments that Zach talked about in solar and wind resources. And we do see that there is a need for some sort of firm capacity, whether it's running on natural gas today and in the future, whether there are zero carbon fuels such as biogas or hydrogen that may be available to be substituted down the road. So there's one more summary slide for this section, and then I'll turn it back to the OPPD team. So just to recap some of the conclusions from the resiliency analysis, we talked about for case study 1, how moving to net zero carbon, the reliability challenge switches from the traditional hours of peak demand in the summer to these extended low renewable events in the summer nighttime and especially the winter period. However, firm capacity is able to maintain system reliability during these events. And then we looked at an extreme summer case with further resiliency stresses. We found that this event could be withstood with the portfolio that we've developed. We looked at the polar vortex-like winter cold event that featured the potential for major customer outages if the fuel availability challenges are not properly mitigated. We talked about some of the options for mitigating those challenges. And then we also discussed with the OPPD team how extreme localized events such as a tornado or a flood could impact some of their critical assets, and how the OPPD system could withstand and recover from this type of event. And our conclusion there is that it really depends on OPPD's connection to the SPP market to be able to secure its necessary essential reliability services. So if there is one of OPPD generators that gets destroyed, for instance, by a tornado, then there may be sufficient generators across the SPP market, assuming that the interconnection still remains. If that tornado were to instead take out one or multiple transmission lines that interconnect OPPD to the SPP market, then the OPPD system would be in a more precarious reliability position on its own. And we do recommend a few options to further study this type of event with specific contingencies and targeted reliability investments to ensure resiliency, as well as coordinating with other SPP market participants to develop the right types of flexibility products so that the market can sustain reliability even if one of the load serving entities is impacted by one of these types of events.
Yeah, good.
So with that, I will turn it back to the OPPD team.
I was going to say, good summary, Aaron. I think when we look at these different scenarios, there's certain scenarios that are energy security, fuel assurance types of solutions. There are certain scenarios here where it's really around total resource adequacy and just having the right mix of resources at the right time and planning for that. And I think that last one, the extreme localized event, really shows the importance of OPPD, being part of a larger integrated networked system. That when we have local issues, we can rely on others. Just like if they have issues, we can help support them. So, interesting, larger resource adequacy issues, emerging topics like energy security, but also, just the continued importance of being part of a larger, stronger grid. Unfortunately, ERCOT, did not have that when they experienced the event that they experienced earlier. Okay. So, Jamie or Sarah, over to you to facilitate some comments.
Right, it's been pretty active in the Q&A, and we appreciate that. Also appreciate your patience as we try to get to everyone's questions. This is an opportunity where your voice can literally be heard. I don't know that we had any call-in users. If so, it's *3 to raise to lower your hand. But in the bottom right-hand corner of everyone's screen should be the Q&A option. Excuse me, and the raise hand option. So if you'd like to come off mute, we can take care of that for you. If you'd like to verbalize any of your questions, now would be the great time to do that.
And Jamie, just one thing, we don't have a ton of time left. and we do have to get to the key findings. So if there's any clarification questions or like really important questions, we can answer them now. Otherwise, we do have time at the end after we go through the findings that we can address them as well then.
Absolutely. I don't see any raised hands off the bat. Given that sentiment, Colton, we can go ahead and move forward.
Okay. Okay, now for the much awaited key findings. So we mentioned this several times, but we've had a lot of work to come to this point. We're going to share with you OPPD's findings from all of the work that OPPD and E3 teams have been working on, and also all the comments that we've received from stakeholders as part of this constructive collaborative process. So some of these findings are going to seem relatively straightforward. Some of them, maybe not so straightforward, but all of them took quite a degree of diligence, to make sure that we're focusing on all of OPPD's mission, not just the environmental goal or strategy, but also ensuring that we have an affordable and reliable system and service to our customers. And so with that, let's start going through these findings. So the first and most important finding, we have found that OPPD can achieve net zero while balancing affordability and reliability. So net zero is achievable with projected generation and transmission cost impacts of approximately 10 to 20% over time by 2050. At the same time, we can maintain sufficient levels of resource adequacy so we can support that reliable and resilient system. 2. The second point is cessation of coal generation and reduced use of fossil generation. And so to achieve net zero, we know that we need to reduce emissions. And that means that generation from fossil resources is reduced in all net zero scenarios as is increasingly displaced by low carbon resources. All scenarios ultimately repower or retire OPPD's coal generation by 2050 and maintain firm resources with minimum capacity factors. And just so that's not misunderstood, I think that there's a variety of speeds of implementation, but all of them end up in the same place with reduced reliance and utilization of that fossil generation. Third, a mix of new low carbon resources, including renewable energy, energy storage, and community-wide energy efficiency will be required. Large quantities of low carbon resources are required to displace fossil generation and reduce emissions across OPPD's system. So part of that is community-wide energy efficiency. There are things that OPPD will be able to directly incentivize, and then there are other things that really rely on our partnership with the community, things like building codes, energy codes, and just adoption, promotion of newer technologies, and more efficient homes. So all of those things are going to be very important as we displace the thermal generation with low carbon sources. Okay. The fourth that we found is that firm generation is needed. It's required to maintain resource adequacy. While wind, solar, and energy storage and demand side resources support reliability, but they have limitations, especially during these certain extreme weather events. Firm resources are required to support the system and maintain electric service to customers. So we've modeled a huge number of weather conditions and scenarios, and there are just times when no matter how many renewables or how much storage you add on the system, you start to get into very significant challenges. And so firm generation is part of the solution to maintain a reliable and resource adequate system. 5. Alluded to this earlier in the presentation, but resources are consistent across a variety of pathways. So this was really very interesting. Even with breakthrough costs and emerging technologies, there were a core or common set of resources that were common across a variety of scenarios. And so it's those same set of resources and those same set of decisions, and those are pretty much set by what is our pace of decarbonization or speed of implementation that affects our emissions reductions over time. The other thing here that we learned is it's the same relative scale or proportion of resources no matter what your load level. So as you have higher levels of load, it's just more of all of the resources. As you have lower load levels, it's less of all of the resources. But the relative proportions of resources are consistent across the pathways. And 6, absolute zero emission scenarios are substantially higher cost and very dependent on future technology development. And so we evaluated net zero and absolute zero conditions, and achieving absolute zero with current technology requires impractically high levels of new resources at significantly higher cost. However, emerging technologies such as hydrogen, long duration storage, small modular reactors, all have the potential to make this more feasible. I think what's important here is that we can get very, very, very high levels of decarbonization and still achieve net zero. Going back to that first point, affordably and reliably. And 7, accelerating decarbonization reduces cumulative emissions at a relatively low incremental cost, but poses implementation and integration challenges. So if you recall from the cost graphic that Zach had shared earlier on, is speeding up those decisions, they're all the same decisions, is relatively low incremental cost because you're still investing in the same resources and making the same decisions. However, this is going back to the last workshop. When you accelerate the timeline, you have to start to add more and more levels of resources each year to meet the goal. We haven't talked extensively on implementation challenges during this workshop, but we haven't previously. And so, there are really challenges around how fast can those resources be integrated into the electric grid. What's the supply chain look like? What's the financial impact, in the near term? And then also as the grid transitions, what are the operational risks as you accelerate that timeline? And then 8, the changing resource mix will pose new resiliency challenges that must be evaluated, understood, and mitigated. Critical resource adequacy periods are expected to change from peak summer conditions to periods of extreme cold or extended periods of low renewable generation. Like we saw that just in the resiliency section today. Grid resiliency will depend on how utilities anticipate and prepare for these extreme events as the grid continues to evolve. And so, we're not just managing the traditional risk of system peak, but we're also having to have laser focus on, many other times of the year where you may have protracted low periods of renewables, and how are we anticipating those, planning for them, managing them, and operating a reliable system, with all of those considerations. Okay. So those are our key findings. We will talk briefly about next steps, and then we will have time for Q&A and comments. So the next steps that we are planning, well, first is that we set out to study actionable pathways to eliminate or significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from OPPD's energy portfolio while balancing impacts on reliability, resiliency, and affordability. We have found those pathways as part of this project. We have invested significant effort in a very broad study, and so that's been accomplished. Secondly, is the study that we've done surpasses any of the previous work to understand the directional changes required for OPPD to achieve net zero by 2050, and the information that we've produced as part of the project will inform OPPD's leadership and its board of directors to support future decision making. Third is that we're going to take these findings that we have from the study, and we're going to incorporate them into the long-term horizon in OPPD's integrated resource plan that will be filed with the Western Area Power Administration in February of 2022. Advanced engineering and financial studies are required to understand the impacts of the specific decisions, as well as additional questions arising from the energy portfolio work. So this is a high-level study. We always knew that there would be detailed analysis and additional work required. And in 2022, OPPD will take the next step in its net zero planning by initiating advanced feasibility studies for supply and demand side opportunities. So we've done the initial work here. We have directional results. We have that information that's provided to decision makers, and we know that we have additional work to do on these detailed studies around very specific assets going forward and investments. Okay. I mentioned that we'll take these findings and we'll plug them into the integrated resource plan's long-term horizon. We've talked about it previously, but the first 5 years of OPPD's integrated resource plan will be reflective of the many resource decisions put in play through the Power with Purpose initiative that are still in progress, that being our addition of 400 to 600 megawatts of utility scale solar, our addition of the Turtle Creek and Standing Bear Lake natural gas facilities, retiring North Omaha units 1 through 3 and repowering units 4 and 5 from coal to gas, which will result in substantial near-term emissions reductions. Our next steps as far as outreach, we'll have a public release of the IRP at the second week of January 14th. Then we're going to have a stakeholder meeting. I said tentatively it's February 3rd. We're kind of dialing that in, finalizing the exact date for that, so stay tuned. And then we'll submit by the end of the month, in February 28th, 2022. Okay. Before we do comment, because we'll have comment just very shortly, let's go through the next steps here. So again, that IRP engagement or presentation is the next chance. We've already facilitated a lot of collaboration and comment with this effort up until now. So that will really be just a presentation of what's in the IRP. Next slide, please. There will be many ways to be able to continue to engage with OPPD. I said there's the IRP engagement. You can also provide comments on this through OPPD Community Connect or reach out to us, and we can, through OPPD Speaker Bureau, there's numerous opportunities where we can join you in your organizations. I don't know, Jamie, did you have additional comment on these next steps?
It's either me or Sarah. We're going to do a couple of options for your survey. So please make sure you do complete the survey. We take some time to put those out there because we still want your feedback. So a couple of the questions are particular to this particular session, but there are some in there if you've been with us along the way. So please give us your feedback. I hope you've seen that we have implemented comments from our customers repeatedly and will continue to do so. Integrated Resource Plan meeting is coming up next year. OPPD Community Connect, we've said it a gazillion times and we'll keep on saying it. We'll be posting the recording and the presentation to that website. We'll be offering comments through 1217. And there's always the chance for the Q&A there. If we don't get to any questions here, you always have a way to reach us on Community Connect. So please go to oppdcommunityconnect.com if you haven't already. And then, as Colton mentioned, Speakers Bureau, if you want us to come be a special guest in any of your presentations or meetings, we're happy to do so.
I just wanted to add to that would be written comments on the final results, not initial results. Sorry about that little typo there. We did have a couple of poll everywhere questions that, looking at the clock, we won't do during this presentation. I'm just going to go through them real quick though, because that might get your brain thinking of what types of feedback we are looking for you to perhaps give us on OPPD Community Connect. This first question, where we know that we've shared a lot of information with you throughout the whole workshop series and also today. And we really appreciate you stuck with us, and looking, it's already 5:59, you've stuck with us this whole time. We'd love to know what stood out to you personally. So if you could please go back to us on OPPD Community Connect and let us know if anything stood out to you. We'd really love to hear that feedback. And then also, as we are moving on to that next step, that integrated resource plan, what thoughts or questions do you have for OPPD as we wrap up this study and integrate results into our integrated resource plan? Help us get to that next step with any additional thoughts you have there. So again, we won't go to poll EV now because we really want to give you an opportunity to use your voice and ask us questions. And I apologize that we're already at 6 o'clock, but if you stuck with us long enough and you have a burning question, now is the time. We'd love to hear from you. Please let us know if you have questions by raising your hand.
Yes, is there a question or comment?
Right, exactly.
So
We have a couple of great ones. Thank you, Mr. Preister. You're always so courteous. We love having you here. We appreciate you being part of the process. And of course, Mr. Young, we'll document your email address and get you on the list for the follow-up and engagement. No problem whatsoever.
Yeah, and I did want to, that's a good point. You know, all of you that have engaged with us at this workshop, we keep a list of your email addresses. So we will be in touch with you as we get into those next steps with IRP. You will get emails from us. You'll get regular communications from us. Also, OPPD Community Connect is your go-to source where we will continue to give you updates with where we're at with this process. So please bookmark OPPD Community Connect and get a hold of us there as well. Do we have any hand raises, Jamie?
No, I don't see any just yet. We're still just working to address a couple of the ones that came in via the Q&A.
Somebody
there's a
asked, I
couple, I'm so
believe,
sorry. There's a
if
couple that
we,
just popped up.
I just wanted to address real quick. We will be posting this presentation on OPPD Community Connect as well as a recording on OPPD Community Connect. So you could look for that, you know, within the next 24 hours. We'll have all that posted for your review on OPPD Community Connect. And go ahead, please go to the
No
hand
worries.
raises.
Chris, if you could help me unmute, we'll start with Arnaud Manas. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for, first of all, the quality of the presentation and the transparency. I wanted to ask, as you look at the finances that are needed to implement this plan, what do you expect your large commercial clients' role to be? Should they just sit back and relax and trust that you will achieve those goals, or should they have an important part to play here in terms of PPAs or other?
sorry, we're working through internally, but I think, you know, right now we've just provided the level of information for the study, and you know, I think I'll turn it over to maybe somebody on OPPD's executive team or others if they'd like to address the question.
Thank you.
This is Javier Fernandez. I'll address it really quick. We can't do this alone, right? One of the main findings here is that this is what we're showing today is what we OPPD can do and have control over. But I think embedded in your question is the fact that we can't do this alone, and it's not just commercial customers; it's residential and industrial customers as well. So I think the future will definitely include conversations and partnerships for us as a society to help address this issue. So I can't tell you exactly how each commercial or industrial customer or residential customer will engage, but our plan is for us to engage with all of them, acknowledging that us alone cannot solve this issue. So.
And Javier, this is Lisa Olson, Vice President of Public Affairs for the people on the call. Thank you so much for joining us. As you know, there were pathways on the customer side as well as the community engagement side that was a focus for us. And so we will continue putting those plans together and engage our customers along the way at the appropriate times so that they can plan as well. Thank you.
Okay, and I think we, the next one I had was from Mr. Apologize, is it Rennie or Rennie?
Rainey.
Go ahead, sir.
All right. So I'm participating in a couple of these so far, and everything that you guys have been presenting, from what I see, is going to put us into energy poverty. If you don't include nuclear into this scenario to phase out fossil fuels, we are going to be in energy poverty. NuScale has small modular reactors. They're light water reactors. They're about half the cost of a traditional four-loop pressurized water reactor. They're set to bring their first one online in 2030 in partnership with Utah. But if you continue down this path of trying to take up all this land to put up solar that you only get power during the day, you're going to put us in energy poverty. And this completely contradicts what Governor Ricketts was talking about when we had that cold spell back in February. So unless you start getting serious about getting nuclear, this is not going to work.
Thanks for those comments. I know the team is actively, monitoring and paying attention to the state and commercialization of nuclear technology. So, NuScale is one of those companies that's on our radar as we're monitoring for cost decline. So, great opportunity. I think, the modeling showed that if they can achieve the cost declines that we saw, that they're part of the solution and part of an economic solution. So, definitely something that the OPPD team is monitoring for more information. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Rainey. I'd like to move on to Mr. Lester.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right, a couple items. One, could you add in somewhere in your presentation or comparison of the inflation forecast on the rates versus the scenarios? Because it's you were talking about an increase, but if it's in proportion to a larger increase over the time, on some of those scenarios, it's not significant difference between them. Also, on another item, is there any combination that you have besides the scenarios where you have the extreme weather events, where you have a percentage of over/under production that you would expect with each of the scenarios for the different years, to how much of it would be overproducing in wind and solar on March day per se, or versus the summer or winter? And my other item is, do you have any risk assessment on what the staffing levels would need to be in the future? I know you'd be reducing staffing levels in the fossil division, but you would have to be increasing staffing levels probably in other areas. Has any of that been discussed, or and is that going to be included in your integrated resource plan? And did you take into account the infrastructure bill?
Okay. Thank you.
I know those are a whole series of them there.
I'm going to try. So the first comment was on inflation and how that impacts rates over time. We haven't included any incremental inflation forecast. We have it all in the analysis, but there's so many other factors that come into our total rates that we're showing the incremental difference, and we're not showing what inflation might impact it, or there's a variety of other factors that can influence total rates over that horizon. So this is just the incremental difference, and that's what we have for now. The question around the resiliency modeling with variable levels of renewables, there are periods where there is significant overproduction of renewable generation, and there's also a market opportunity with how that's used. I think we talked about that a bit in workshop number 5, but there may be future opportunities with how that energy is used to make, for long duration storage, to make hydrogen or other economic uses, things that we don't know today. And then the comment around OPPD's workforce transition or transformation as it relates to the energy portfolio work, we don't have that information right now. What we've tried to do is have a very transparent, open, high-level study, and so we're just getting these results and providing them to leadership and the board on what the potential resource impacts are. So there's a ton of work that still needs to be done to understand factors like that. And OPPD is focused on that as well. So I think I got all of them. Was there anything I missed, Louis?
Just the infrastructure bill, was there any of the impacts that you on the one that was passed already for the that might have an impact on your study or some of the results as far as margins?
Yeah, we have not incorporated any of the impacts of the the resiliency bill into our current analysis. I think the direction it's moving, though, or at least I understand it, and the direction, the outcome that we have from the energy portfolio work are very consistent and harmonious and headed down the same direction. So there's probably opportunities for OPPD incremental to what we've identified here. So not sure if there's others at OPPD would like to address that, but we weren't able to. It wasn't available in time to incorporate into the assumptions of the modeling.
I think we probably have one more hand raised that we can address real quick. Laverne Tran.
Yeah, thank you. Great report. Thank you so very much for doing this work. I know OPPD doesn't like to spend money on things, and the fact that you guys spent so much time and energy, it almost makes me want to cry a little bit, because I'm somebody who've been trying to get OPPD to do this for so long. But anyway, I didn't hear anywhere where in your scenario you were producing your own hydrogen. I know he just mentioned you're over generating sometimes. And so I just didn't hear that, but I just may have missed it, where you can generate your own hydrogen. The reason I'm saying that is because right now they're building ships that are going to be hydrogen electric, airplanes that are going to be hydrogen electric. Hydrogen is going to be in such high demand in the future for this clean carbon future for all the different industries, that being in the business of creating hydrogen and selling it to ships and planes and to the rest of the industries. I don't know if you stuck that in your analysis, like actually starting a whole new business of creating green hydrogen for the rest of the economy. I know you talked about exporting electricity, but exporting hydrogen, to industry, I don't know if you put that in your scenario either. So that's two questions. And then the last statement, nuclear just is not carbon free. Everything about nuclear is carbon intensive unless you actually, except for the actual reactor creating electricity. Maintenance, transportation, mining, the refuel, refining, everything is carbon intensive, and they're one of a kind units, so they don't enjoy mass manufacture. I'm so glad your reports did not choose nuclear and could see the. And then I know you're keeping an eye on the small nuclear, and I just want to remind you of OPPD's history, which is we were promised 3, paid for them, got 1. It's the smallest one in the fleet. It was taken over because 3 of the safety things were eroded out of 4, and then they were shut down because it was the smallest one in the fleet and did not enjoy economies of scale. So now the nuclear industry has come back to you and said, we have even smaller nuclear reactors. And somehow they've, sprinkled some sort of magic dust on it, and now it's going to be even more profitable. I just trust me not to believe them. You're young, I'm old, I've seen them. They're not truthful. Their technology is not sound. And I don't know if any of your scenarios put in leaving waste, and the fact that all these other choices you have are renewable. Nuclear is not renewable, never will be, never can be. And I want to know how much the fact that these other energy sources have, not only are they green, not only are carbon free, not only all that, but the fact that they're renewable. How much does that play? Because that is a moral question that you just can't leave nuclear waste for the next generation. I mean, come on. Anyway, so 3 questions, I guess. Did you get them?
I got the comment one for sure.
I know, but I had 3 questions about the hydrogen. Really.
Yeah, and Zach or Aaron, maybe you can address the source of the hydrogen that we use in the modeling.
Yeah, this is Aaron. I can address that. So the hydrogen that we model in as getting selected in the absolute zero scenarios is essentially sort of a drop-in fuel into the firm capacity that's modeled with a small cost increase being able to burn either natural gas or hydrogen. So the way we model that is as a fuel with a certain cost. So that cost comes out to about $16 in MMBTU in 2050. And the cost for that includes the production of that via dedicated off-grid renewables, and then the storage of that in a low-cost geologic type of storage reservoir with a pipeline delivering the hydrogen to OPPD. I think as we see the sort of hydrogen economy evolve, you could imagine different types of arrangements for hydrogen production. Perhaps the pipeline distribution system that carries natural gas around could be replaced with one that carries hydrogen around, so that might provide more of a broader marketplace for hydrogen across the economy. But I think we'll have to see how that technology and that market evolves over time.
I think that addressed our hand raises. Still actively trying to answer some of the Q&As that if we don't get to, we can obviously respond via email or on OPPD Community Connect, but I think that's it for the hand raise.
Okay. Thank you, Jamie, for facilitating that.
Sure.
Appreciate everyone's comments. Of course, they can provide additional comments to us and the team. More than welcome to do so. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this process for the last 8 months, from the first workshop till now. So, really appreciated all the comments, all the perspectives to this point, and hopefully we still get them. But really appreciate your participation, and thank you for joining today, our final workshop on the energy portfolio modeling.